Elise, welcome.
Thank
it's
you,
nice to have you with us.
Lovely to be here, Ian. Thank you very much.
No, it's my pleasure. So can we start just by you telling us a little bit about, I suppose, why this book and why now?
Gosh, why now? Well, it's actually a book I started more than 15 years ago. So now is a very, very good question. It's something that I began with an inspiration a long time ago. I've been teaching, as you said, creative writing for more than 20 years. And I started noticing little bits and pieces to do with, insights to do with creative writing process as a practitioner and as a teacher. And I also started noticing slowly but surely that creative writing was having positive impacts on my life. And I was curious about the connections between creative writing and well-being. So my antenna was up and I was listening out for and looking out for any clues that might link creative writing and well-being along the way. And they included disciplines as diverse as Tai Chi and psychology, ancient Greek Stoic philosophy, and meditation. So along the way, I've been accumulating this massive file of ideas, prompts, references, research, my own observations from teaching classes and workshops. And I started writing chapters, and in between novels and day jobs and filmmaking and everything else, I have been adding to this book. So here it is.
Yeah, well, and it's a lovely book. I mean, I've read it and really thoroughly enjoyed it. And it's interesting that one of the things that you mentioned there is about the range of sources, I suppose, that you've drawn from to write the book. And it seemed to me that part of the point was that in our lives, we all have such a rich range of experiences that we can draw from, and that all is something that we can use to channel into writing, whatever form that's taking. And I just wonder whether you could say a little bit more about that.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of being engaged in any creative practice. The universe, throws tidbits at you all the time, and all your experiences in some way, shape or form are interesting, either as direct material or as influences or inspiration. There's a lovely idea by Nietzsche, the philosopher Nietzsche, which is that all of this goes into your compost and it becomes proper compost. It has to be well-rotted compost, of course. And then from that compost comes the flower. And I think of, creative practice working along those lines. It's all rich feed for that compost that then produces this wonderful creation.
Yeah, what a lovely idea. It's kind of the mind as a garden, a fertile garden. I like that. And it's interesting. I mean, writers, are we talking here about a book which is a how-to book, or are we talking about a book that is more about people thinking whether they want to and how they might approach whatever form of writing they're interested in?
It's a hybrid book, as the influences and inspirations are hybrid. So in some ways it's very, very practical, but in some ways it's quite philosophical, and it's also a kind of provocation to think and to address and to discover one's own creativity within, but also to look at the side effects and cultivate those. So ways of living that go very, very well with, ways of engaging in any creative practice, but particularly with writing. And in the end, it's sort of about well-being, but it's also about being able to feel empowered and to use your creative resources to become a positive agent of change in the world. So it's not just about self, it's also about empowerment and communicating and self-expression, but also hopefully affecting positive change.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting that your introduction, the title to the introduction is I Dare You. And I wondered what made you start there.
Well, I just want it to feel like a provocation. It's not just another plodding how-to manual which says do this, and at the end you'll have a novel or anything like that. I really want it to be much more existential in its scope. And without pretending to be a philosopher, I did study philosophy at university, but I'm not a philosopher by living. But my career has been quite a hybrid career. And so I've kind of tapped into all of those different influences. And I think one thing I've learned about creativity is that it does involve a bit of risk taking and a bit of daring. And it's not about filling boxes or ticking boxes and being well behaved. At some level, we have to risk failure. We have to risk provocation. We have to risk doing something that hasn't been done before, even in the smallest way, because of course, if something is truly creative, it hasn't been done before. You are actually making something new. So I think that sense of daring needs to be all the way through creative thinking and creative practice, particularly with writing.
And it struck me that in the style of the book, and we'll talk a bit more about its structure in a minute, and the content, but the style of it was as much for somebody who wants to write a letter or an essay, or wants to write themselves a diary or a musing, as much as it might be for somebody that wants to write a longer piece, a prose piece or poetry, or and whether that's a novel or short story or whatever. It seemed to me you were inviting people across the range not to approach this book from the point of, I want to write a big project novel and how do I do it, but much more about how can writing be part of my life. Would that be right?
That's a really lovely take on it, and I like that a lot, and I will agree with it for sure. But I think part of my inspiration was that a lot of students come to me thinking that they need to write a novel or they have to write a novel. And I often find myself asking the question, why does it need to be a novel? And sometimes it might be something else, but people have this sense of this kind of great big magnum opus and the daunting challenge of that. And it might be that actually a short, beautiful, well-observed, well-written poem is actually the place that they might want to start. And you're absolutely right. In the end, they might not write that novel. They might not write even that collection of haiku. But the fact that they've engaged with the practice of creative writing and the thinking that is involved in the research and the attentiveness, the noticing, all of that can actually feed into later on perhaps writing better letters, better emails, better business reports at work. And in fact, in one chapter, I talk about a woman who had been a student of mine and years later wrote to me and said, I haven't written that great novel. In fact, I haven't written any novel. But something happened to me as a result of doing that course. And she found that her emails and communications at work were becoming more effective, that clients' issues were being resolved more efficiently. Her colleagues were reading her business reports and making really positive comments about them. And then her manager noticed all of this and gave her a pay rise. And then she later on had a promotion and another pay rise. And she wrote to me to say all of this because it was all a lovely indirect result of her having really thought about every word she put down on paper, not in a kind of self-conscious or constricted way, but in a thoughtful way and in a way that best expressed the communication that she wanted to put out there. So that's a lovely side effect of this. So I think sometimes we burden ourselves with this idea of the big project, and that can be quite terrifying. And we want to make it perfect, and we want to make it important, and we want to make it big or glamorous. And instead of all of that, if you scale back and think, why am I writing? What am I writing? What's the purpose of it? That can already help steer you into a perhaps more appropriate direction.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, because one of the other things that triggers for me as I was reading the book is it occurred to me that we often think about writing as being the product of our experience in the world. But in a way, what the book where it took me in part was thinking the writing process raises our awareness of the world much more. So by becoming more acutely aware of things that are happening around us or the way we're interacting with different situations, the writing process actually helps us think differently and work differently and act differently with people we're involved with. Does it make sense? Yeah,
that's absolutely makes sense, and I'm really glad you've had that that insight, because that's something that it took me quite a while to notice myself. And I've been writing books and whatnot for over 20 years, but I started when I was little, but of course I had no idea then. And as a grown-up, really properly engaged with the practice, this is partly what inspired the book. I have noticed that the practice informs the way I live, and the way I live starts to inform the practice, and the two become fascinatingly dovetailed. And I don't think you can write very well if you don't properly look and see or hear or smell or feel. All of that noticing, that kind of perceptive fitness that comes with writing, is something that then starts to connect very much with something like mindfulness and meditation. And then the more you become observant, and I don't just mean visually, that can then feed into the writing practice. And it becomes this lovely mutually informing process. I think that's it's for me been a really fascinating discovery.
Yeah, and it's interesting that your hand language there is about flow, ebbing and flowing, and
Yeah.
I felt that
Oh,
about
the
the
hands, I
book.
can't keep them out, can I?
No, no, but that's good. No, that's good. I mean, I like that because I'm the same. But I observe that because it seems to me a little bit that the structure of the book is like that, isn't it? Well, perhaps you can tell us a bit about the structure of the book rather than me describing it.
Okay, so the idea for the structure came to me quite a long time ago as well, which was that it should work with its own kind of narrative arc. So there are happy beginnings, happy middles, and happy ends. And as they suggest, they sort of are about beginnings and middles and ends. But having said that, you can dip into the book, in the middle or at the end, depending on how you want to be inspired or not inspired, or what you want to learn about, or what you want to refresh your memory on. So happy beginnings are more about incitement and excitement. Happy middles are more hands-on, fueling up. You're deep in the process. And so I guess it's a bit more technical. That's probably the closest the book comes to how to. But even then, I hope it goes well beyond, the literal of the practical exercises and prompts. And then happy ends are much more about resolution and resilience. So they're some of the beautiful side effects of engaging with the creative writing practice, as well as the resilience that you need to pursue something to the best it can possibly be. And I think sometimes people think you can just dash off, if something's short, you just dash it off. That's fine as a first kind of starting, place. But if you work on something and develop it and think it through, you can polish it and perfect it. You can edit it. You can make it the best it can possibly be, your best. And there's something very satisfying about that, very, very rich. And then going beyond that, as I mentioned before, this idea of going beyond yourself to the wider world. So it's about your own health, but it's also about your social health and your political health as well. And I mean political in the broadest sense of the word.
Mm. Yeah, well, thank you for that. And it's worth saying as well, I think, is that you mentioned the happy beginnings, middles, and ends, but within each of those sections there are a lot of very short. I mean, the chapters, if I can call them that, are 1 or 2 pages, aren't they? And I wondered why you chose that structural form.
Well, the book started out much longer. You can probably imagine. I've killed a lot of darlings. I've kind of cut down possibly to about a half of what it used to be, because I kept on paring. This is what I was just talking about in a way, editing, paring it away to the bare essentials, and hopefully then not throwing out anything that was germane, but really, really cutting it back and back and back so that you could read it with brevity, but also intensity, so that I wasn't wasting the reader's time. But there are some chapters that are much longer as well. So there's a chapter somewhere in the middle about plot, and plot is a big one, and there are whole books devoted to plot, and people are terrified by it. And it's kind of, it justifies investigation, and it would have been too throwaway to just give plot a few paragraphs or a couple of pages. And I also, by the same token, didn't want to falsely divide it up into different chapters. I wanted it to be that if you wanted to remind yourself or be inspired or to feel more confident about approaching plot, you could just go to that chapter. So that's quite long compared to some of the other chapters, which are, I think, deceptively short because they might require perhaps more contemplation time. So the prompt or the provocation might be something that doesn't have specific nuts and bolts in there, but is a, I suppose, prompt to think, to contemplate, and that might take weeks or months even, rather than sitting down and going through an exercise or looking at the history of or practicing the techniques.
Yeah, I mean, certainly all those well, both the shorter and the longer sections in there left me pondering. I mean, that was what it did for me. It gave me thoughts to meander around in my brain a little bit during the course of the day. So I could pick the book up, I could read for 10 minutes, but the 10 minutes was then staying with me, and it's been rolling around in my mind. So I think it works very well from that point of view, from where I sit. And it felt different to some of the books perhaps that are designed. I mean, this is a technical book as well as a philosophical and another thoughtful book, but it seemed a bit different to some of those more technical manual type books. It's not written in that way, I don't think. That's not how I experienced it anyway.
No, and I was very aware of that. You know, my first degree was in English literature and language, so there's a hell of a lot of literary criticism in there, and drawing, you know, from examples from sometimes famous writers, sometimes from student writers, people I've taught. So in that sense, there's lots of inspiration from just different sources, and there's also quite a keen, I think, awareness of language, and you know, the detail of language and the love of language, and that's something I think is really, really important to any literary output. So it starts with a love of words and what one can do with words, and the differences between words, and the colors and the shapes and the sizes of words, the idea of translation, the idea of being foreign to words or foreign to a language, and making yourself foreign to a language. All of those ideas are kind of hopefully ways in which the reader, who is also hopefully a writer, can get into, you know, under the bonnet of language itself. And so rather than, you know, writing cliches or whatever first comes to one's head and then being happy with that, or a lot of rubbish and being happy with that, I'm hopefully encouraging you to write a lot of rubbish, because that's often a really, really good way to get started. But then to find what's good in the rubbish, to root around in the rubbish, and then just take out what is really working and is really the thing to save. So yes, it's lots and lots and lots of different sources. I probably spent as much time getting permissions for all those quotations from all those authors and philosophers and translators and publishers and rights holders and agents. My goodness, I've got a huge Excel spreadsheet, which is just full of names and details and dates and emails and contracts. Extraordinary. But I really wanted it to be a polyphonic work. I didn't want it to just be my voice, you know, going on and on and on.
Yeah, well, I loved it. I'm just gonna read from section 100. It's only a short sentence.
Very last one.
The very last word, and I just like to ask you to comment, you know, kind of help us understand why you finished there when I finished it. So you say, now is the beginning of the future. The quality of your now affects the quality of all your future nows. Now is the most important time of all. I wonder why you left it there.
Because it's now. And, you know, we can spend so much of our time living in mauvaise foi, to use the existentialist term, you know, living in the past or having regrets or living in the future or blaming other things outside of ourselves for not doing this or not having tried that. And if we stop and take stock and commit to this process now, we already start to take control of our lives. I know the world is, you know, in control of us too, and I know there's the chaos of experience, and there are many, many things we can't control. But the beauty of creative writing is you need a pen and paper, or if you're really lucky, a computer, or a quill will do. It's very low tech. It's very low tech. You can write War and Peace with a quill and a, you know, piece of paper, basically, and there's nothing stopping you in a way. So instead of saying, I'll write that novel when I'm 50, or I've got a book in me, or you should hear the stories that I've, you know, well, sit down and do it now, start now. If you have the desire and if you have the impulse, do it now, while you have a brain, while you have breath, while you have the desire to do it. You might find that by going through that exercise, you've exorcised some demon. You might find that you discover something beautiful. You might find that it leads to all sorts of paths and interesting avenues in your life that you couldn't have imagined before you started. And that's partly what the book is about too, the way it opens doors, opens up new experiences, new people. And so now, doing it now, starting now, affects tomorrow and the day after in ways that you can't predict, and hopefully in ways that are very positive. I think usually they are positive. So that's my ending to the book.
Yeah, well, that's lovely. I enjoy that. And of course, for every one of us reading it, our now is very different, and that's the joy, isn't it? I mean, just here's an almost impossible thing for you to do then. So if you were going to do an Insta-sized or a tweet-sized summary of what the book is for, what you're hoping it's going to be for, and how people will receive it, what would your thought be?
Okay, I'd say it's a guide to writing well with positive side effects. And in a way, it's about living well and using your creative skills to become an agent of positive change in the world.
That was lovely, Elise. I really enjoyed the way you described the end to the book there. So thanks very much for that. I mean, just before we do finish, I mean, we started off the discussion by talking about the breadth of your experience, both in terms of your academic and design past and all sorts of things that you've done it in your life. I wonder whether you just like to say a little bit about your other work, because you've published 4 novels as well as this book. I might have got that wrong, but is it 4?
Do you know, I get this wrong. I literally have to sit down and name them in my head to count them, but I think there are 4 novels and there are 2.5 books of nonfiction and various items of journalism, and there's poetry, essays, that sort of thing, quite a bit of online writing as well. So yes, yeah.
Yeah,
that's
and
right.
what's what in terms of all your other the fictional work then, if I put it in those terms, the novels in particular, what is your interest? What's the sort of subject areas that you like to explore through those works?
Do you know, it's really interesting. I've never set out with a specific subject in mind. It's more like an idea just tugs at me or captures my fancy, and it's very exploratory, the process. I start with a little bit of grit, and I've always had this idea in my head that it's like a hailstone. That little bit of grit has a little bit of water on it that makes a little thin layer of ice, and then slowly but surely it builds up layers, and in the end it ends up being a kind of hailstone. I'm not sure how positive an image that is, but it's the image I have in my mind anyway. So it's a slow process of accretion, and it's very inefficient. I don't recommend it to anybody. It's quite groping. I don't know where I'm going with the story. I'll start with this tiny little seed, or this little bit of grit, and it slowly but surely grows, and it grows with contemplation. It grows with actual writing. So I do the mime job there, but also that sort. So I have notebooks and notes, and I obviously use the computer as well. And I do lots and lots and lots of research, because I find that if I am writing about X or Y or Z, I can't just make assumptions. I need to be well informed about that, even if it goes to a place that I find really difficult or alien to me. So one of my books is set in America, and it grew out of a dream that I had scribbled into a notebook years earlier. And I realized that I couldn't write a novel set in America without doing really, really thorough research. But the novel in the end, as I wrote it, became obvious to me, was a novel about surveillance and celebrity. So the theme, if you like, or the subject, was something that emerged in my awareness as I was doing it. And towards, I suppose, the middle and towards the end of making it, in recent years, I've become much, much more engaged with my heritage, which is Italian, specifically from the Veneto region. And I've been teaching workshops on migration stories. I teach a lot of people who have experienced migration, either through their family history or themselves. And I'm very, very interested in what happens with migration and its connections with storytelling. The idea that your view of the world is already predisposed to metaphor, because you are already comparing this place and that place, this experience with that experience, this culture with that culture. And there's this notion of duality that people live with on a daily basis, this idea of a place that is utterly foreign and yet utterly familiar. And so my first book, I suppose, tapped into that, and my more recent novel, The Madonna of the Mountains, tapped into that, and the work of fiction I'm working on now also taps into that. So I guess that is a bit of a theme. Well, I wrote a book called The Book of Happy Endings, which are true stories about people finding love, and that was a commission, but it's one I undertook with great, great, great zeal, and had the delight of interviewing strangers about how they met and fell in love. But then I wrote them as short stories. And another novel I wrote began as a lot of little short stories inspired by newspaper articles to do with people dying in surprising or unexpected ways. And so I wrote all these little short stories, and I had no idea why, but the voice of those stories was a very particular voice. And so then I spent a long time trying to think, who is the voice behind those stories? And I decided that it was a kind of modern day Tiresias. So someone who could see, but had a lot of issues, problems, of his own. And he ended up being a person who worked in an all-night garage. And so to help that story go along, I went and spent a whole evening, the graveyard shift from midnight till 6 a.m. behind the glass in the garage. And I was the only white person in the place. Everyone else was Tamil, apart from one guy who was Nigerian. And this became very fascinating and interesting to me. And so I ended up exploring and researching the whole Tamil diaspora. And that book ends up being a very London book. And it's as much about this guy and the stories that he sees, but it's as much about that as it is about the Tamil population of London. And at the time of writing, the Tamil migrants here were actually at the top of the migration lists because of the troubles in Sri Lanka. So it felt quite political as well, and very, very engaging. So it became a novel about that, but I didn't set out to explore that as such. But clearly you can hear there's a theme of migration in there that really compels me.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's fascinating. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, you say that the Happy Writing book took 15 years to write. And I can see, listening to you talking about the diversity of your other canon of work, how that flows its way through the book as well. I mean, you're drawing on all those different writing forms and inspirations throughout. So I think those two things join very clearly for me. You seem to me to be the kind of writer that conjures pictures in people's minds, and that's what writing is about, I suppose, isn't it? But I'm left today with images of compost and gritty ideas that are going to kind of grow and flourish, and I have a very active sort of imaginings of the way you write and think, and that comes through in the book beautifully. So congratulations on the book. I think it's a wonderful, well, it's not a guide, it is a guide, but it's not a guide, is it? It's an inspiration to people to think about how they write and how that affects their lives. And I think I loved it. I loved the book, and I certainly recommend the Madonna of the Mountains to people as well, because I read that recently, and I don't often give glowing feedback on books, but at the risk of embarrassing you, that was one I did love, and it stayed with me. So I certainly recommend that to people as well. So at least we could chat all day. I know we could, but I think we've got to come to an end. So thank you very much for sharing your time with us here, and I look forward to talking with you and meeting with you again.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, great. Well, have a lovely day.
You too. You too.